So this presentation was actually inspired a little bit by Westboro Baptist Church, this is one of their sons, I believe, or nephews, wearing the GodHatesFags.com shirt. If you read the flyer, it says, "Does God hate fags?" That's the question I'm going to try to answer today. But also it says that this is a sociolinguistic study of gender negotiations. Now, when we think of gender negotiations, first of all, very, very, very quickly, how many sexes or genders do we have? Officially recognized 2. We know better, right? But in the Bible, when we talk about gender negotiations, we're talking about power negotiations, power between the male and the female. I'm going to be using this word a lot, binary or binaryism. So binary thought means that our sexes exist as male versus female. There's a clear, decisive point where male begins and female begins. But what it doesn't really do is address this section in between. Both the biological, let's say, hermaphrodites, or the, cross-gender thinking people, whatever you want to call them, right? Now, what's important to the Bible is that it maintains this natural hierarchy, which is male is above, female is below. It can't have this space in here because it throws off the Bible. Do you have any Christians in here? Okay. Okay, good, because I wrote 2 different speeches. One if Christians were here, and one if they're not. Oh, you're one? Okay. We're also going to look at this concept, covert words, or covert rhetoric. Any covert rhetoric implies something else, but we're going to be talking specifically about covert gender words. Farmer versus nurse. Farmer is a male, nurse is a female. Airhead versus shithead. Airhead is a female, shithead is a male. I'll also be using this word, genderization. That's the process of creating covert words out of things that aren't normally gendered. So the definition would be to add gender to an object, concept, or idea. So these are some of the words I'm going to be using. Now we're gonna find that a lot of this hierarchy, the male versus female dichotomy, is really based out of fear. So I'm going to talk about fear just a little bit. Then we're going to talk about female versus male, and then we're going to talk about homosexuality or gayness. Okay, so what does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous, if not monstrous. It means that we are eventually food for the worms. This is terror. This has emerged from nothing. It has no name. It's just self-consciousness. It's deep inner feelings. It's the excruciating yearning for life and self-expression. But in the end, it's death and worms. Man's confusion with consciousness, coupled with the evolutionary imperative to fear death, would soon create an anxiety so unbearable it was necessary to medicate. Fear is at its most fearsome when it's diffuse, scattered, unclear, unanchored, free-floating, with no clear address, with no cause, with no rhyme and reason, when the menace is nowhere to be seen or found. The quest to locate and immobilize fear would be undertaken over and over and over again through the centuries, through the millennia, but would eventually succeed with the people of Judaism 3,000 years ago. Fear was discovered and at last revealed so that all could see the roots of evil. And so this book of power was written through fear with the task, and when the task was complete and the ink was dry, evil had an unmistakable shape, which I'm asserting is the silhouette of a woman. It's important to note that she is the only reason why page 2 of the Holy Bible was written by its author, who would fill thousands and thousands of more pages explaining her exploits, her infidelity, her stupidity, her nature. In this paper, I argue that the book of Genesis, the Bible's metaphorical parent, establishes a paradigm of gender construction closely followed, reestablished, reinforced throughout the entire throughout the entirety of the Bible. I assert that the male and female exist as binary opponents, meaning opposites, in the war of mankind, while the protagonistic male represents future, hope, good. The antagonistic female represents abysmal failure, evil, and ultimately the end. For this reason, I describe the silhouette of the female body as the intangible code for evil in what I term covert gender discourse, which is just a fancy word for covert words, right? I also provide a new term that describes the forceful or subtle processes of applying gender characteristics to an object that is not normally gendered, therefore subjecting it to a process I call genderization. This is adding gender to something. The initial inspiration comes from this article by scholar Moshenbacher, when he speaks of rhetoric that he calls covert gender, which implies gender in such words as asshole or shithead. In biblical connotation, all references to God implicate masculinity. For example, some of his titles, Lord, Host, Master, Father, King, all masculine. Their official names, God's official names, Yahweh and Elohim, there are both masculine nouns in their respective languages. As we will see, the Bible offers an internal perspective and a calculated formula of the woman, which is always held ransom to the subjectivity of men and his eagerness to maintain notions of male superiority. So let's begin. Firstly, is God male? Obviously, God is referred to thousands of times as he throughout the Bible. But Christians will often say that, God is neutered, God is genderless, God is grander than human genitalia, of course. To the Christian mindset, this is fact. But I would argue that when the divine is addressed as male literally thousands of times, it is because he is in fact male. If we look at the parallel influential religions of the time, particularly Greek mythology, we see that all gods were subject to genderization, and or referred to as some sort of beast. Sea creatures, dragons are popular. Judaism also has sea creatures, and dragons, and talking dogs, and talking lions. But differently, its divine creatures, its angels, and its God are strictly male beings. In fairness, there are a couple exceptions when females can be considered divine, but they have to do something to prove their worth, as, for example, give birth to Jesus. Then she becomes divine. So we'll begin our search for gender, first by contemplating the incentives and desired outcomes of biblical pedagogy. Pedagogy is the politics of teaching. Education is ideological. Education is never neutral. We must be aware that Christian leaders in power today are masters of God's social identity, just as much now as ever. Biblical interpretations and conclusive opinions of God's word serves new masters every generation. With each generation, these new masters exert their own personal will over both the written word and the loyal follower. The art of teaching is never an innocent endeavor. It remains someone's dream to organize the future for others. Teachers always have a moral and political dimension to them. We must also consider who the intended audience is, the teacher's intent, and for the purposes of this paper, the gender relations between said parties. When Paul, the apostle that is responsible for roughly half the New Testament, when Paul says, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection," but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor usurp authority or power, but to be in silence. We find numerous clues as to who is what gender identity, whether the passages are instructions to be taught by males or orders to be followed by women. Furthermore, we can unquestionably conclude that the deity that passed on this message to Paul obviously has a special interest in male supremacy. But is there any other proof that God is male? Judaism of 1000 BCE was just another minority religion amongst hundreds, if not thousands, of other religions. Judaism followed the same superstitious trends as every other religion, with the exception of its monotheistic leanings. And the Old Testament teachings were meant to be just as literal as any other religion of the time. We'll begin to realize that the divine author has a much more accurate perception of what it's like to be male than female. This next section I titled it, Of Hope and Semen. Now, the title of the subsection may seem that it's laced with satire, but none was actually intended. And here's why. In the 4th century, St. Augustine, the elder responsible for the original sin concept, insists that through, quote, sexual desires, and since sexual desire is transmitted to everyone through the very semen involved in conception, it is tainted with sin from the mother's womb, end quote. Another biblical contemporary of his was this guy named Julian, who he would spar with academically, write letters back and forth to each other. He says, God made bodies, distinguished the sexes, made genitalia, bestowed affection through those bodies to which they would be joined, gave power to semen, and within semen it operates the secret nature of God, where nothing is evil. Semen arguments are nothing new. Very rarely do I hear the observation that the Bible is actually a patriarchal account of mankind's history. Mankind itself, the word, is a gendered term. It implies patriarchy. For example, the Bible often has huge and lengthy patriarchal bloodline passages. But a feature that's very important to these genealogies is not necessarily the information included, but the information omitted. It's the birth of women. There is rarely any mention of daughters being born because females were just not important or crucial to any generation after Adam and Eve. There is not one genealogy of daughters or one that starts with a mother. There seems to be no necessity for it. Although, to the Bible's credit, it does make mention the first 3 wives of our first 3 patriarchs. But it also mentions and emphasizes that they're barren, which is a dismal disappointment to a Jewish man of the time. What I find fascinating about God's apparent obsession with semen, often it's called a man's seed, to symbolize the planting or growth of a tree, maybe even a family tree, a patriarchal tree. God places great symbolism in the seed. Actually, so much so that he goes out of his way to personally bless certain men's seed. He blesses their semen. Semen represents hope. Semen represents the future. Semen represents patriarchy and power. I realize this might be a wild interpretation of the male emission, but God too has no problems talking about penis size or seminal ejaculation. In Ezekiel 23:20, God says, these are God's words, "There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose emission was like that of horses." In blunter terms, God is describing a whore who loves multiple dicks with large loads of semen. It's statements like these that God makes himself that makes me question the seed of life theory. Furthermore, returning to my central thesis, if we analyze this statement that God just made, ask yourself, is this a male perception or a female perception of pleasure? At the very least, I can say that God would have made an excellent male pornographic filmmaker. In recent years, we've seen the revival of what could most appropriately be called dominionism or dominion theory. Recently, we've heard politicians using dominion theology to support radical claims of American policy. President Bush eventually revealed his reasons for going into Iraq in June 2003 in a world broadcasted interview, saying, maybe I'll use my Bush impression here. He says, "I'm driven with a mission from God. God will tell me, George, go and fight those terrorists in Afghanistan. And I did. And then God would tell me, George, go and end that tyranny in Iraq. And I did. Another very important aspect of dominion theology is that it asserts that Christians are responsible for shepherding and preparing the world for the second coming of Christ. They are making preparations for us. In this section, I will present information that supports my theory that women are also to be subservient in this dominion theology. In this very 2012 election cycle, we've seen the fundamentalist Christian belief that abortion should be banned, even in cases of rape or incest, in favor of personhood policy, which holds that the moment of conception is the moment that a person begins to have rights. Missouri Representative Todd Akin has gained a certain degree of infamy with his statements describing abortionists as terrorists. So if abortionists are Al-Qaeda, then women must be the Osama bin Ladens in this situation, passing on the instructions to the terrorists. To take this even further, Senator Rick Santorum has stated that rape should be seen as a gift from God. Those are his words. A sort of half glass full of unsqueezed lemonade, right? There seems to be this Christian consensus that women should not have power to make their own decisions on behalf of their own body. But when did she lose that power? In popular cultural accounts of the Adam and Eve story, Satan the serpent is often portrayed as this cunning deceiver that fools Eve into eating the apple from a fruit tree, who in turn curses humanity. When we observe the actual biblical account, there's no long, drawn-out argument or debate. There's no personal dismay or temptation from Eve. The conversation is, in fact, a grand total of 5 statements, 5 exchanges. It takes less than 30 seconds to read. All evil stems from this stupid girl. Not a fooled girl, not a smart girl that was fooled. She was essentially, from the very beginning, a stupid girl. Apparently she has no foresight of the possible consequences of her actions. And so God lays down a personal punishment for the serpent and the woman. In Genesis 3:15,